Good afternoon and welcome to Policy Exchange's agenda set of path-breaking podcasts on Russia's war on Ukraine. We've had a fantastic series so far. We're honoured today to have Mary Kissel, former senior advisor to Secretary of State Michael Pompeo, before that a senior editorial writer on the Wall Street Journal, and now in the private sector at Stevens Inc., an investment firm, New York-based as Mary now is, doing all of their policy work and policy advice. Mary, you've been a great friend to Policy Exchange and, more importantly, still a great friend to the United Kingdom during your period at the State Department and the enormous policy impact which you had. I think there's tremendous interest here, and this is the theme of today's podcast, is the GOP and foreign policy, the impact of Russia's war on Ukraine on the GOP, following on earlier the debacle of the American retreat from Kabul last summer. And I think it's really the same question, is what impact these shifting geopolitical sands, dramatic events have had on the internal balance of forces within the Republican Party, and particularly what seemed to many of America's friends from outside to be a shift towards a certain form of neo-isolationism. Over to you, Mary, for your net assessment of that.
It's great to be with you, Dean, and thank you very much for the invitation. I think before we get into the party dynamics, I just want to say really what's at stake here in Ukraine. We're at what George Shultz, I think, called a hinge point of history, where we're either going to return to the free world liberalism, US-led order that we've all enjoyed for several decades now, or I think we're going to go to a 1930s style scenario, except this time around, the countries that dominate those spheres of influence will have nuclear weapons. It would be a far more dangerous world. Now, you asked specifically about the Republican Party. One thing that is notable to me as I went around Capitol Hill recently and I talked to folks over here is the bipartisan support for the people of Ukraine. In fact, it's much like the bipartisan awakening on communist China. And that bipartisanship is pushing the White House to change directions, not once, not twice, but multiple times, whether it's from the fact that they were for Nord Stream 2 until they were against it, they were against SWIFT sanctions until they were for it, they were against banning Russian oil and gas until they were for it. So we have seen a kind of unity in Washington that I think is notable, laudable, and very welcome. Now, you talked about a new isolationism within the Republican Party. That isn't just a Republican phenomenon, of course, because President Obama was really the president that started that pullback of America from the world. So it's on the left and it's on the right. On the right, the way that one would describe it, it's called a new right, which makes it sound kind of progressive and exciting, but really it's an old and tired idea, which is that America just shouldn't get involved anywhere. We should retreat back within our own borders, take care of Americans at home. I think there are several flaws to this. We can get into that, but it certainly is a new feature of the party. And it builds on, as I said, a theme which I think has been in the works for quite a while across administrations.
Of course, Joe Biden was elected to the United States Senate in the year of 1972 with George McGovern's losing campaign by a massive margin, Come Home America, which was the effective thing. I think what's surprising to people in Europe is the degree to which that kind of Come Home America rhetoric can now be found within the broader conservative family in America, if I can so describe it, if that's the proper term of art. And that there seems to us to be some kind of a dissonance or disparity between what the regular elected GOP politicians are saying, and indeed amongst national security experts on the one side, and the sort of if I can put it this way, the broader conservative talking heads like Tucker Carlson on Fox News giving a different impression towards us. And I'm just wondering what the impact of that world of talking heads would be on potential future Republican presidential candidates and indeed GOP primary candidates in these coming midterm elections this year?
Well, Dean, I think that's going to depend on just how bad what I call the cascading crises become in these following weeks and months as we lead up to the midterms and then ultimately to the presidential election in a couple of years' time. Americans are instinctively isolationist. Remember, I think it was John Quincy Adams who said, "We don't go abroad in search of monsters to destroy." It took us a long time to get into World War II. We don't naturally want to go out. And when we do make hasty decisions, like George W. Bush did in Iraq, we haven't done so well. And so in the post 9/11 era, I think there have been many people in the Republican Party who have been quite disillusioned, not just with the choices that have been made by the leadership, but how those conflicts have been prosecuted. And so there is a natural tendency here that I think elected leaders have to swim against. I would caution you against characterizing, the attitude of the party based on a couple of talking heads on television. I mean, Tucker Carlson may have a large audience, but there is quite a revulsion here in the United States to the kinds of terrible, what can only be described as war crimes, targeting innocent civilians and using certain kinds of weaponry in Ukraine. What impact that has on the leadership is in some ways a moot point because Republicans aren't in power right now. Their power comes from that bipartisanship that I talked to you about, that unity on Capitol Hill, which is the longer that this goes on and the closer it inches to NATO, the more pressure is put on the one man who really is determining U.S. foreign policy right now, and that's President Joe Biden. My fear, Dean, is that we are not exerting the kind of deterrence anymore that prevents these autocrats and terrible regimes from pursuing their expansionist ambitions. That's the real danger here. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about the appeasement of Iran. It's about this instinct to dialogue with communist China. These are very, very dangerous tendencies in American foreign policy today.
In terms of the resilience of the American public during the Cold War was very, very considerable. It was, for the bulk of the period, as you describe, it was also bipartisan, certainly in terms of maintaining security in Europe, even after, in the wake of the divisions of the Vietnam War. That was the case. It's interesting now, I mean, in the person of Trump, who obviously there's the great speculation about will he, won't he run again this time, but Trump being criticized early in this crisis for his pro-Putin stance, and then in South Carolina in recent days making that statement about potentially using US nukes to deter Putin from, or even having to use them. And I'm just curious, obviously, with his instinct for opinion of the grassroots, just as a reflection of where that grassroots opinion is, it seems that in many ways that American public opinion is as robust as ever. Perhaps, as I say, because of the reaction to the events in Kabul last summer, the humiliation of the departure and the loss of American kit there to the Taliban, and now the Putin emboldened to undertake acts of aggression. So I'm interested if Trump is, in that sense, a bellwether of American opinion, just of how robust that grassroots opinion within the GOP is as a reflection of the wider American heartland. And Trump, Trump following that as much as molding that.
Well, there are several strands to pull on here. Firstly, when you think about the Cold War and the American approach to confronting the Soviet Union, while the American public was very, very robust, as you say, in their opposition to the communists, the policy approach was not always agreed between or within the parties. You had, remember, Nixon and the arms control agreement that he and Henry Kissinger struck with the Soviets, and you contrast that with Reagan and a very different kind of stance, which was a military buildup and a lot of pressure on the Soviets. So we're just at the, I think, beginning stages of that sort of conflict with the Chinese communists, and there will be a lot of arguments. One thing that Trump did that I think was very important for conservatives is that he questioned the received wisdom of the last several decades, the post 9/11 era, to say what really is America's role here in the world. He was ridiculed, for instance, when he said, would we send American boys to go fight for Montenegro? Now, it was kind of a crude way to put it, but his larger question is an important one, which is NATO is now a 30-member alliance. What is the purpose? Has it expanded too much? Should we focus it? Are nations fulfilling the mission? What should the mission be? And now we see that those are very important questions because NATO has taken on a new importance given Putin's aggressions, basically on the borders of NATO. President Trump, when he talks in his way, when he talked about the use of nuclear weapons, that is a classic Trump tactic, and it's basically meant to scare. You saw him do this when he threatened fire and fury against North Korea. You saw it again when he dropped a major bomb on Afghanistan, the Moab. You saw it when he bombed Syria after the Russia-backed use of chemical weapons in Assad's Syria. In effect, he was establishing deterrence so that Putin wouldn't dare do what he's doing today in Ukraine. And I think it's notable that out of the last 4 presidents, the only one where Putin didn't dare attempt this geographic land grab was under Trump. And also, too, Dean, you used a phrase, and I just want to make sure we explore this a little bit. Trump's rhetoric was one thing. It was quite conciliatory toward Putin. In fact, he used a lot of phrases I didn't like. But by the same token, Trump was the most punitive when it came to exacting consequences on Vladimir Putin. The most important thing he did was unleash U.S. energy. And so Putin didn't have the war chest that he has right now. Secondly, he sanctioned Putin's inner circle. So Biden's actions, I think, very, very laudatory. I'm glad that he's imposing some costs, but that started under Trump. And he armed Ukraine. Now, Trump didn't arm the Ukrainians enough, obviously, because they're desperate for various kinds of weapon systems and material right now. But when you look at the record of what Trump did and Putin's reaction, I think it's safe to say that the U.S. was deterring Putin under Trump, and that under this president, unfortunately, the gestures that were made early in the administration to rush back into the New START treaty without any sort of give from the Russian side, the endorsement of Nord Stream 2, which was a reversal from Trump, the botched exit from Afghanistan, and other signals essentially told Putin, as it did under George W. Bush, as it did under Obama, it's okay for you to try this right now. And indeed, we saw that deterrence when President Biden stood up and he said, we're not going to send troops into Ukraine. Now, many on the left and the right may think that's very, very prudent and actually the right approach. But you don't need to say it. You need to say, we need to leave all options on the table. You try to invoke some uncertainty on the other side. That's how you maintain deterrence. That's what's gone. That's why I'm afraid that this crisis may not just be confined to Ukraine. It may bleed over into the Gulf and, God forbid, into Asia Pacific.
In terms of NATO, how much do you think, when you look back at the Trump years, the anti-NATO rhetoric damaged our overall deterrence posture and the willingness of Russians to, as it were, size up our capacity and desire to respond to any potential aggression?
I was always very struck at the gulf between how the media was reporting on the deliberations within NATO and how the actual deliberations were going within the room. Take, for instance, the INF treaty, which Russia, an arms control treaty that Russia had been violating brazenly for years. There was a debate in the Trump administration about what to do about that, because if you have a treaty where one side just doesn't honor it, well, what is the treaty worth? And in fact, we were able to get unanimous support within NATO for our withdrawal from that treaty. It was the first withdrawal from a major arms control treaty in quite some time. That doesn't suggest disunity within NATO. It suggests quite the opposite. We worked with NATO in Afghanistan as we were doing U.S. troop drawdowns in stages to ensure that as those drawdowns occurred, that you wouldn't have chaos on the ground, that the Afghan army wouldn't lose control in some of the regions very far away from Kabul. Secretary Pompeo had a very, very good relationship with Jens Stoltenberg. They talked regularly. So I think, again, there was just a major disconnect between, I think, what the British public and the American public were reading in their newspapers and hearing on television and what was actually going on behind the scenes.
Of course, in the US system of government, the people are sovereign. And in terms of their resilience, when the price comes in for the robust action that necessarily has to be taken now against Russian aggression there in Ukraine, I'd just be keen on your thoughts. For example, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the longshoremen were willing to boycott Soviet vessels in that period. There was then tension with some of the farm states, including within the GOP again, particularly because, of course, most of them those farm states were in the Republican camp, about how much of a sacrifice they were willing to make. Obviously, the cost of living crisis, as in the United Kingdom, is central now in the US, inflation rampaging ahead, and therefore, the likelihood of democratic losses in the forthcoming midterms. I'm just, in the light of the wider economic concerns over energy costs and so much else besides, how much of a willingness do you detect that the American people will be willing to make sacrifices because of Russian aggression in Ukraine?
Well, Russian aggression in Ukraine has only aggravated an already existing supply chain crunch. And energy prices in the United States, a large portion of the price hikes are due to domestic U.S. policies, not to what's going on with the Ukraine war. Because under this administration, we killed a major pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, that was running from Canada into the northern United States. We halted drilling on federal lands. But most importantly, we launched across several U.S. federal agencies an assault on exploration. And so now you have major U.S. financial institutions that don't want to extend the lending for exploration and for production because they're simply afraid that these projects won't go anywhere because they'll get wrapped up in red tape. So it's actually within the U.S. The U.S.'s control to once again become the price setter in global energy markets. And, I talked earlier about the bipartisan alarm at what is going on with Ukraine. Well, there's a bipartisan alarm that's starting as well about this really runaway inflation, because every politician understands that when Americans go to the polls, they largely vote with their pocketbooks. And when you see, used car sales prices up more than 40%, when you see gasoline trending up on average, between $4 and $5, when you go to the supermarket and you can't buy chicken and pork because the prices have gone up 20 or 30%, I feel it myself here every day. You may get another 180-degree turn out of the administration because Americans are tolerant of these problems, Dean. But there's a limit to that tolerance. And, it hurts the poor and the middle class the most when you see this kind of hyperinflation. And Democrats are very sensitive to polling, just as Republicans are when they're in power. And, Americans are getting deeply concerned about the state of the U.S. economy, and also concerned that it's happening at a time of such chaos abroad. Now, Americans are not as dependent on Russia as Europeans are, so I would anticipate that the economic pain will be felt far more keenly on the continent than it will in the United States. We're just lucky for that, in that we have natural resources and energy resources that Europe does not at the time. But it's interesting to me to see many European nations, Britain included, that are re-examining their energy mix and saying, you know what, maybe we'd love to have this transition to renewables, but we can't do it right now because it's not economically viable. Let's open up and develop more LNG ports. Britain has a ton of energy that you're sitting on. You just won't frack and get it. But it's within our capability to mitigate some of the volatility that's coming out of Ukraine and to ease the pressure on consumers. And I hope that the leaders of all of our free world friends, including in the United States, do it and do it fast.
And just final follow-up on your question, Mary, two things. One, and you've touched upon it to some degree, but a little more explicitly to draw you out a bit more on that, is how big foreign policy, national security will be in this year's midterm elections, and two, early prediction from you on the internal balance of forces in Republican primaries and B, in the general election come November.
I think Americans will largely vote on their pocketbooks because the war, while it is horrific and it's blanketing our television screens, is not directly impacting them. But of course, it will have some impact. What the balance of that is, I simply don't know. And in terms of the primary outcomes, there are natural cycles in American politics. And whenever you have one party, whether it's a Democrat or Republican party controlling both the executive and the legislative branches, the natural cycle is that the opposite party then wins the midterms, because Americans largely like balance. We like making it difficult to pass laws. And we often have split government. I would anticipate that to happen again in November. The magnitude of that switch is to be determined. I never underestimate the ability of Republicans to screw things up. So it always depends on the local level, on the quality of candidates. We have seen some indications of potential surprises. Look at the results of the recent Virginia governor's race, where you had Glenn Youngkin, a former private equity executive who wasn't really known on the national political scene, winning in a fairly convincing fashion a very, very purple state, which says to me that the electorate today is not the electorate of 2, 4, 8 years ago. The American electorate and its preferences change over time. And I think one of the mistakes that we make when we look at the political landscape is you tend to look backward and think, well, people are going to vote the same way they did before. Here's the breakout of Republicans versus Democrats. But it's really those votes in the middle that matter. And that's who politicians of both parties are going to go after.
Mary, thank you for, our time is up today. Thank you for being our first American visitor on the Agenda podcast series here at Policy Exchange. Set a high standard for our future visitors in the weeks and months to come. Look forward to welcoming you back very soon. Thank you again. Over and out.